welcome everybody to RAG on Zoom tonight. I really hope nobody's gone to UCL tonight, because we were saying to people it will happen at UCL, but we've tried to make sure that nobody's gone there. And very sadly, we have Jerome with us, but we can hear what a poor state Jerome is in. So if he needs to go for a nap and lie down, we understand. But we're taking the title, Women's Biggest Husband is the Moon, which Jerome uses as a metaphor of gender relations with the Bayaka and how the egalitarianism is maintained. And we're going to take that on a tour. We're going to look at Bayaka with Chris using material he's been working on with Jerome. I'm going to do a bit of a contribution on the Hadza, and we also have Eleanor here, who can help. And Ian Watts will then take us to some nightstand hunting and the Bushman cosmology. And so we're going to do a big tour of African hunter-gatherers and lunar cosmology, fundamentally, to demonstrate its persistence and widespread as a phenomenon. So we're going to start with Chris. Chris, you take it away.
Okay, well, I'm going to be reading out some extracts from Jerome's PhD in a moment. Woman's Biggest Husband is the Moon. But just to say a few things about the fact that hunter-gatherers mostly are matrilocal, in the sense that, at least for the first years of a woman's life, once she's become a woman, once she's gone through her coming of age ceremony and can get pregnant, she chooses nearly always to live with mum. And what we know is that we now have very amazing genetic evidence that in Africa, where hunter-gatherers mostly are, or have been into quite recently, successful hunters of big game, we know that we don't exactly have dates, but the evidence seems to be that for perhaps thousands of years, women have been living with mum down the generations. And one of the things that means is that women aren't under the power of their husband and in-laws. If you're living with your mum, you've got an immense amount of kinship leverage. And this economic system, strangely how little this is understood for these egalitarian immediate return hunter-gatherers, that's hunter-gatherers who don't give storage. The economic system is called bride service. And why that's relevant to this discussion is because a man never gains conjugal rights in his wife. There's never a time when he says, right, you're my wife, you're married, therefore I can have sex with you. It's always negotiated, it's always conditional. And if a man doesn't behave, if he's lazy, if he's rude, if he's abusive, if he can't be bothered to make himself useful, he's out. So the idea that women's biggest husband is the moon sort of fits into that wider picture that a woman never really belongs to, in any final sense, to her husband. And even the word husband is, I mean, we shouldn't translate that into the, into the kind of language of Western ideas of kinship. Even though, interestingly, of course, the very word husband means bride service. It means a person who does the husbandry for you in order to keep his relationship with you. That goes back into a sort of etymology. But what I'm going to do now, with that little background, is to read out from Jerome's PhD, and a large part of the PhD, and also a very amazing, wonderful article in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute in 2008, is about an absolutely critical concept, which is Aquila. Rather than me sort of try to define it, I just read out what we have here from the PhD. And here Jerome is quoting one of his informants, Emeka, who says, Aquila is the name of the medicine Komba, that's the kind of god, the big spirit, the name of the medicine Komba sent women when women put in the moon. When women put in the moon, that means when they menstruate. The business of Aquila was first with them. It is all about children. You can see women's tummies swell up at this time. It's the wind. They have to expel their wind as blood, which tells me that the word wind there kind of means something like spirit. And in so many different cultures, the life spirit is, of course, the blood here. Wind, the wind as blood. This cleans out their wombs. If that blood stays in the body, it will make the woman ill. She has to get rid of it. If she doesn't do Aquila, then she has to do Aquila. That is how it should be. Women's biggest husband is the moon. And he carries on, if I'm a hunter, I don't sleep around with different women. If I slept with her and then her and then her and then her, all the animals would know. They would smell my smell and know that hunter has ruined his Aquila. When you shoot at an antelope from close range and it doesn't die, we call this Aquila. If someone's hunting is good, they won't say his Aquila is strong. They will say he hasn't ruined his Aquila. So we're seeing here that Aquila is kind of hunting luck, but it's so much more. And as we go on through the PhD, it turns out that really just about everything in the culture of the Benjeli, this particular group within the Bayaka, the forest hunter-gatherers of this part of the Congo, almost everything that makes them hunter-gatherers and makes them egalitarian and makes them who they are is intimately connected with this concept, Aquila. So he carries on, even a great hunter who sleeps around with women all over the place will ruin his hunting. Many of you will know that in my book, Blood Relations, which I published in 1991, I developed the theory that in hunter-gatherer cultures, men don't really hunt because they're hungry. They hunt to prove that they are a man. And those who decide whether or not they're worthy of being called a man are the women, and a man who's useless, lazy, abusive or whatever, the problem is he won't get any sex. And what I'm seeing here now is an example of what I called sex strike strategy, which actually isn't really a theory. It's just what happens in bride service. When in a bride service society, a man who doesn't prove to be a man, prove to be courageous, generous, a good hunter, modest hunter as well, he probably won't get much sex because women just won't be. Collectively, the women will decide that he doesn't really deserve it. So if you have too much sex, especially before a big hunt, that's going to ruin your hunting luck. So in order to keep your hunting luck, you have to be careful about sex. So even a great hunter who sleeps around with women all over the place will ruin his hunting. Women's blood is one thing, men killing animals is another. So we have this identity as well as simultaneously contrast between women's blood and the blood of the hunt. So Jerome describes how he's just been citing Emeka, and he says, on another occasion, as I sat in Fanta's leaf hut in the forest teeming with large game, Fanta pointed to his sleeping mat. And this is a quote. This is where I sleep, all alone, just me, without any women, by myself, on this mat. I don't sleep with my wife anymore because of Aquila. My Aquila is big, very big. I kill elephants, bam. Come Betty, old men like me don't screw women anymore because of Aquila. So as I read that, I'm thinking, well, when you get to a certain age and you're, a little bit beyond sex, the idea here is that because you're not having a lot of sex, that should make your Aquila very, very strong, and therefore you should be very successful in the hunt, even to the point of being able to hunt very large animals, difficult animals like elephants. And then Fata goes on a little bit more about these connections between sex and hunting. The idea being, of course, in general, as you'll find right across Africa, actually, the way to destroy your hunting luck is to have sex just before the hunt. The way to ensure that you have good hunting luck is to make sure that you're not having too much sex before that difficult activity. And it's women's responsibility or task really to make sure that men are successful in the hunt by making sure that they don't have sex before. So after your wife has given birth, is going on from there, you must not have sex with her until the child can walk. Otherwise, you can kill the child. It's difficult because women are very beautiful after giving birth. And this is Fata explaining it's not always easy to keep away from your wife. She's very, very attractive, but you've got to do it. Don't even go hunting because a gorilla or elephant will attack you. Women have Aquila too. A woman's Aquila is with the moon. When a woman is Aquila menstruating, her husband takes her smell, so he doesn't go hunting or walking in the forest with friends. Animals flee when they smell a woman's mobeku. The animals smell her on him. If strong, dangerous animals like elephants, buffalo, leopards smell it, they will come even from far away, charging towards you in a rage, passing other people by just to get to you. And Jerome says, well, why do they do this? And the answer is, well, combat just made things this way. We don't know what the animals are thinking when they come. They just get angry when they smell that smell. And in so many other cultures, of course, with hunting, that's translated in a slightly different way, with the idea that men are in some ways courting the game animals. This isn't happening here. They don't put it that way. But when you're courting the game animals, the idea in many other cultures is that if you've had sex before the hunt, the animal you're courting is going to get jealous and therefore won't make things easy. So in big forest, this is another informant, Cabello this time. In big forests full of large game, having sex is mabeku, a huge Aquila. This is because we are in conflict with the animals. If they smell the odor of women, some are frightened and flee you. Others come from far away and follow you, only you. That's why women are frightened in the forest. The animals smell them. So this is describing, and I'll come to another quote where Jerome goes into some detail about this, that men and women are very different in the forest. Men don't want to make a noise because they want to surprise the animals, whereas women with their children really don't want to be having to encounter potentially dangerous animals, and so make a lot of noise. And so the fact that that when you're menstruating and the animals may be dangerous animals may be particularly attracted by the blood, smell of the blood, that means you've got to make even more noise. And then very interestingly, we find as well that it is Aquila to burn human blood-sucking parasites, thus chickas, ticks, fleas, tsetse flies, mosquitoes, loa flies, leeches, and so forth must never be disposed of in a fire. It is also Aquila to burn any bandage or other item containing human blood. Now that relates to a very famous essay by Rodney Needham, Blood, Thunder, and the Mockery of Animals. And what's fascinating is this sort of universal of kind of mythology in many ways, that you mustn't cook your own blood. It's almost like incest. And of course, if you put a mosquito or a blood-sucking parasite into the fire, in effect, you're doing that terrible thing. You're in effect cooking your own blood. And then Aquila, though obviously concerned with blood, does not refer to ordinary blood. And Jerome describes how on one occasion he was in the camp where he was staying, drops of blood were seen on the ground around a hut. And this blood was only referred to as Aquila, whereas the normal word for just ordinary blood is mwanda. And the drops here were unanimously said to be traces left by a blood-consuming spirit who had been feasting in the hut. And perhaps if I got a moment, we'll get into some of those ideas about the bloodthirsty forest spirits. Many of the spirits are literally bloodthirsty. They need blood. So translated in context, writes Jerome, Aquila can refer to any of the following: menstruation, nose bleeding, hunter's meat, blood, taboo, animals' power to harm humans, dangers to human reproduction, health, sanity, and the food quest. And what the point Jerome is making is that there's no English word, or actually I would have thought European word, which can possibly translate such a extraordinarily polysemic concept. Aquila sort of means everything to do with taking care that you don't make the wrong move, but the root of it in some very important sense is taking care about blood in general, but in particular menstrual blood. So Aquila exhibits high memorability to its vivid core symbol of menstrual blood. A major point Jerome makes is that if you don't have a sort of education system, somehow the young have got to acquire knowledge of the taboos of their culture by sort of following the breadcrumbs method. And this vivid core symbol of menstrual blood enables that critical, important concept to be remembered. Blood is always highly, it's kind of almost shocking, but just naturally, any kind of blood. But the way to make sure that this concept of Aquila is memorized is to make sure that any encounter with blood kind of evokes this concept. And Jerome writes, menstruation is the ultimate mnemonic for Aquila. So menstrual blood is the kind of the most deeply tabooed form of blood, and therefore it kind of helps to pass on that critically important concept down the generations without need for explicit teaching. And then Jerome goes on to say, I would argue that Aquila is a key component of the way non-explicit egalitarianism works. The Vangeli do not have an explicit discourse on equality. Instead, their implicit valuation of equality crucially underpins the cultural logic of key social concepts linked together through the experience of Aquila. And that's going to be explained in a moment. One of the lovely point Jerome makes is that you have this tension in these immediate return egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, the tension between the fact that everyone's free, every individual is independent, no one's dependent on anyone else, you can always just wander off into the forest and you kind of be fine. So there's that extraordinary degree of autonomy. But somehow you also need in any of these societies to make sure that that doesn't lead to everyone just sort of going their own way and the whole society falling apart. So Vangeli's social organization allows individuals a degree of autonomy and independence that permits a striking fluidity and association between people. This tendency to social fluidity through a lack of dependence on specific others is countered by the ideology of Aquila. So Aquila kind of makes people dependent because Aquila links together in a kind of causal web of connections, women's work, men's work, hunting success in terms of childbirth and babies. Aquila puts all these things together and creates an experience of interdependence, which isn't directly coming from subsistence. The subsistence mode means that people could wander off on their own, and Aquila is another opposite tendency counteracting that. So this tendency to social fluidity through a lack of dependence on specific others is countered by the ideology of Aquila, the complex relations linking hunting and procreation, eating meat and the growth of children, and women's labor with men's create a range of equivalencies, often expressed in the language of cutting and tying. So you cut with somebody if you want to just wander off, you tie if you want to connect people. These relationships negate the uniqueness of gendered production and emphasizes their interdependency. This acts to restrain the potential that might enable one person or gender group to claim higher status than another. Aquila beliefs serve to negate any group's or individual's claim to autonomy and thus acts as a sophisticated ideological leveling mechanism. And Jerome describes how, supposing one man's a very good hunter or seems to have unusual success and somebody else seems to be pretty useless, the danger is that of course that those differences will translate into difference in power or status in the group. And what Aquila does is to negate that, because Aquila is kind of magic, and you don't say, a man doesn't say he's a better hunter than somebody else. They simply say his Aquila is stronger. And that, of course, means that you've been careful not to ruin his Aquila. And you can see, can't you, how that's a leveling device. And of course it prompts everyone to attempt to keep their Aquila strong by being generous and kind of following the norms. So at its most fundamental level, Aquila serves to organize gender roles by defining them as primordial, as bound to bodies and to biological processes. This reminds me of Morna's amazing work, when she talks so much about wisdom being embodied among these same people. Aquila establishes hunting and childbirth as prototypical activities, defining people as men and women, and weaves these roles together in a complex set of interrelationships that serve to counter the strong tendency toward individual autonomy and fluidity in association. A boy begins to learn more about Aquila through accompanying his father while hunting. His understanding of Aquila only takes off after he has realized the metaphoric equivalence implied by labeling the menstruating woman in his family as Aquila too. This metaphoric equivalence between hunting animals and creating children will become clearer to the boy as he gets older. So we have what Jerome and I have called the world's first metaphor. The oldest metaphor, the sort of metaphor behind all the metaphors that we use in language, is the metaphor that when a woman menstruates, that's the same, as well as kind of the opposite, as an animal that you hunt bleeding. Both bloods are needing to be respected. The blood of a woman and the blood of the hunt are different, and in some ways opposite, but equally demanding of respect. And of course, that then translates in many cultures to the idea that you need to respect the animals. You mustn't laugh at them because of their blood. And of course, the metaphor is saying that that blood is in some way the same as the blood of your mother, your sister, which also you have to respect. You mustn't laugh at your sister or your mother, of course, when she's menstruating. And Jerome's describing here how critical sexual behavior is, men's sexual behavior is to having a strong Aquila. But that doesn't mean a kind of rigid puritanical monogamy. You don't screw around, but these people are quite liberated about sex, and particularly teenagers. So just worth perhaps reading out: the sexual encounters of teenagers, being not seriously concerned with procreation, do not seem to harm Aquila unless too many different partners are involved. However, if his mother becomes pregnant, he has to take precautions. And this is very interesting in relationship to the Oka record of human evolution. This is a discussion of red pigment and what it signifies in so many of these different cultures. If his mother becomes pregnant, he has to take precautions. He will prepare a small 3 or 4 centimeter diameter ball of red Mongolian paste made from tree bark. In a very ordinary atmosphere, the pregnant mother will have her lower belly incised just below the navel by her husband. The blood that flows from these fine lines is mixed into the Mongolian paste of each hunter. They will carefully store this red ball in their skin bags for use until the birth. Whenever they go hunting, they will rub the paste ball vertically down the middle of their forehead, creating a red line running from hairline to nose. It's a pity, really, Jerome isn't able to discuss this with us live. Perhaps he will, Jerome, because what Jerome just describes how he just couldn't work out what's going on. All these young men going out to hunt, and they got this red line running from hairline to nose. And he kept sort of saying, well, what's going on? He tried to ask a question, what are they doing? And one of the things that the wind mustn't be allowed to blow on this or take it. And if that red line disappears, the boy won't, the young man won't find game. And he kept getting very sort of uninteresting answers, just like, because our fathers told us, or to make sure they aim well. And anyway, I'll just read this out. I asked a good friend, this is Jerome's words, of course. I asked a good friend when well out of earshot of others, and he explained in a whisper that there are numerous spirits of the Edio type that consume human and animal blood voraciously. And this is a quote: they are very attached to blood and become jealous and nasty when deprived of it. They need blood in order to exist. That's why a menstruating woman leaves her Aquila blood in the forest. These spirits eat that blood and like it more than other blood. They get used to it and will look out for her. When her man cuts her moon and she gets pregnant, those spirits miss many meals. I hope you can see what's going on here. When a woman menstruates, she offers the blood to the spirits, and they're bloodthirsty. But what happens when a man, her husband, gets the woman pregnant? Well, obviously, that she's not going to be having any blood to offer the spirits. So these bloodthirsty spirits are going to get extremely angry. So when her man cuts her moon, of course, that means cuts her away from the moon. In other words, stops the moon visiting her, and therefore causing her to menstruate, so that she's pregnant. That means she's not menstruating. Those spirits miss many meals. They get furious and very jealous of men when they realize. So they try to stop us getting food. But the ancestors found ways to avoid this. That's what the red paste ball is for, the SEO. You don't rub it off. You let the wind take it to the Edio spirits. The blood will calm them so that you can find food. And in addition to that, when they kill an animal, they need to leave critical parts of the animal, again, which they call the akila meat, for these spirits to consume. It's like an offering of certain parts of the animal need to be made to the spirits. So I think that's enough, and I'll stop. I hope. Obviously, we haven't really made much sense of all that. I've just given you some quotes, but anyway, I think it's Camilla now, is it? Don't forget to switch your microphone on, Camilla. Switch your microphone. Microphone.
You can hear now.
No,
Okay.
yeah.
So, okay, on this African lunar cosmology tour, we're going to move from the forests to the savannas of East Africa on the equator, Lake Eyasi in northern Tanzania and the Yaida Valley, where the Hadza remain as still, almost to this day, big game hunters. And the Hadza actually have a very similar expression. Women's biggest husband is the moon, except they say the moon is brother to all women. And notice the moon is male in both the case of the Bayaka and in the case of the Hadza. And the Hadza's, the main aspect of lunar cosmology for the Hadza is their famous Epeme dance, night dance ritual, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in just a while. But this is only to be danced. It can only be danced when there is no moon in the sky under a brilliant array of stars, the Milky Way. So there is only a certain period of the moon when it's possible to do this, to sing and to dance Epeme. But let me just first of all do a little bit about the kind of corresponding taboos on menstruation in connection with the moon, to the Bayaka. Hadza hunters pay a lot of attention to the moon, and especially at the time of Epeme, when there isn't a moon in the sky. This is roughly after the third quarter of the moon to the very early young moon. It isn't the time to go hunting. And part of the reason for that is that lions will be going hunting. So Hadza cosmology envisages a shift system with lions hunting when there's no moon there in the sky, when they can see in the total darkness. But Hadza hunters will go when there's bright moon, and we're going to hear from Ian in a while on the impact of the moon on Hadza hunting. If we look at the taboo structures amongst the Hadza, there's a kind of ideal template of the relationship between hunting, menstruation, and the moon, and it operates through arrow poison. So a wife's menstruation immediately prevents her husband from hunting, for the reason that his arrow poison would not be effective. It's destroyed, it's spoiled. And there's many common ideas like that amongst the Bushmen as well, the Jeune, for instance. In addition, she, a Hadza woman and her husband, they can't have sex when she's menstruating. She shouldn't gather any berries because the berries would fall down and be spoiled. She shouldn't gather any honey because it would become dry. James Woodburn, who's been the longest term ethnographer of the Hadza, described the regular observance of restrictions relating to a wife's menstruation and pregnancy, the relationship of the wife's menstruation to a man's hunting as confirmation of their marital status. So this refers to what Chris was saying about bride service. You know, a man is never definitively and utterly and totally married to a woman. He's got to keep on performing the bride service, and every single moon that a woman is visited by menstruation or during a pregnancy, they have to observe the necessary taboos to demonstrate to each other and to everyone else that they are married. And Tia Schkornes also records an idea that if hunting weapons should be touched by a menstruating girl or woman, then the weapons thirst for the blood of an animal will be assuaged. So it's as if a woman's blood is equated in status with an animal's blood, just as Chris was saying, the woman's blood and the game animal's blood are exactly equivalent. If we ask Hadza adults, they will generally agree and assert that women have a relationship with the moon. There can be different answers to the question, when do women menstruate in the moon? Two very senior, knowledgeable, both a man and a woman, told me that women would menstruate together, and they named the dark time of the moon, effectively the period of Epimet. Women who are still having menstrual cycles rather disputed that idea. They didn't dispute the idea they connected to the moon, but they disputed the timing. And that probably reflects their actual behavioral, they have actually time periods at different times. But they would say, they'd sort of agree and say, yes, it used to be like that in the old days. Now, according to Ian's research, Dorothea Blake, back in the 1930s, with her notebooks on the Hadza, was finding out that the Hadza would be ill, the women would be ill at the time of dark moon. And James Woodburn also heard this belief that there was a synchronization of menstruation at that particular time. In very recent research by Catherine Fitzpatrick, she found Hadza women appeared to constantly monitor the waxing and waning of the moon, as well as its position in the sky. And one of her informants said, I look at the moon every day. The moon says if I'm going to or not going to menstruate. Some women mentioned after the moonlight disappeared in reference to timing. So that this gives us 4 at least, and if Ellen is here, that might be 5 independent ethnographers who've documented Hadza women's association of menstruation to the moon, and specifically lining up to dark moon. So we have Dorothea Blake back in 1930, James Woodburn from the 50s into the 60s, myself early this century, and Eleanor too, and Catherine Fitzpatrick just a few years ago. That is a span of time of a continuity of these beliefs over the best part of a century. A senior Epimem man told me, spelled out in quite digital on and off terms, how the moon itself affects arrow poison. And he did this by using the topography of one of the camps of Yeda Valley, which has a rock wall horizon behind which the young new moon would set shortly after sunset. And he calibrated the efficacy of arrow poison in terms of the hour when the moon set. So if the moon set directly right with the sun, just after the sun, then the moon is too small. The arrow poison would not work. But if the moon waited 2 or 3 hours to set after the sun, okay, the arrow poison would start to work. Now, if it were really true that women synchronized cycles, then this would give us a template. And I'm going to just share screen to show this diagram because it makes it clearer. And this is showing 3 different idioms. If we see Epimet as basically the period before and after dark moon, the late waning of the moon into the early waxing, there are no less than 3 idioms. They're kind of equivalent idioms of when you can't be hunting because woman's menstruation would spoil the arrow poison. The moon itself would spoil the arrow poison. And then there's the moon's too dark and lions would see you. So if a man went hunting at this time, he would end up being hunted by the lions. So there's a kind of reversal process. By contrast with that, after the first quarter with the gibbous moon, that will be the perfect time when there's moon in the sky for hunting big game with good arrow poison. So this is a a kind of ideal lunar template. And in just a while, Ian will tell us about Hadza's real moonlight nightstand hunts. Hadza society in the traditional bush camps is very strongly organized by moonlight and darkness. And this obviously goes with the major ritual celebration of the Hadza, which is Epeme dance, held in pitch darkness for 2 or 3 nights every month around the time of dark moon. Traditionally, most camps would hold an Epeme, the period of the dry season aggregation being very favorable for the ceremony. But even in wet season, somewhere in Hadza country, an Epeme would be danced around dark moon. The ritual needs several adult women providing an accompaniment of very special polyphonic Epeme songs. The lunar phase of darkness is emphasized by extinguishing fires, and everybody does this. So there will be a big hue and cry if any kind of light shows during the ritual. Initiated men, Epeme men, dance one after another, embodying the spirit Epeme or shadow of Epeme, with a costume of a dark cloth, a shining ostrich feather headdress, kembako, leg bells, and a gourd rattle. As the singing grows very strong and moved by joy and emotion, women get up to dance around the shadowy figure who stamps down with a special step on his right foot, the bells jingling in time with the rattle. Tirshkones relates this sound to the tendon clicking of very heavy, mature eland antelope bulls as they trot. The spirited singing makes the mood under the panoply of the Milky Way very ethereal and uplifted. Failure to hold this dance, says James Woodburn, is believed to be dangerous. And I remember when we had 2 Hadza visitors who came over to stay in Hackney in London for nearly a month. So they were there during the time of Epeme, and they were feeling very weak, very vulnerable, that they were not able to participate in an Epeme to maintain their health. Epeme promotes and maintains general well-being, good health, and successful hunting. This aspect of community harmony that unites men as a group and women as a group, it enables harmony-breaking illness to be cured in the Epeme dance. And this is especially talking to illness arising from violations of Epeme rules. And James Woodburn stressed the Epeme dance was about kinship and joint parentage, seeking to reconcile the opposed interests of men and women, so manifest in other contexts. A man may dance in the guise of Epeme 2 or 3 times, each dance for somebody. First, he may dance for himself, and then most commonly for one of his children. That may be an actual child or the representative of the child, an object that's owned by his wife, standing for the child, which could be a gourd full of fat, a precious gourd full of fat, or a stone or clay decorated doll. A man will also dance for other close kin or affines. At each dance, a dialogue is held between the Epeme dancer and the women. The dancer uses a ritual whistling language, special for the context, and women will answer with greetings using the kinship term applicable to the person for whom that dance has been held. Now, at the full moon, at the different pole of the moon, as the moon is wax full, Hadza men and women, youths and girls, will join joyful parties of songs and dances, and there's no restriction on who sings or dances together. And these will be held out in some open space, maybe a dry, sandy riverbed. While Epeme is really sacred, intense, and very emotional, at the full moon, people just really relax and enjoy themselves. So we have this oscillation going on in Hadza's social life through the lunar cycle between relations structured by kinship, dark moon, and then relaxation of those restrictions or taboos at full moon. And this really corresponds to the model of ritual lunar periodicity, which, of course, Chris first developed with blood relations. Okay, now I'm going to say just a little bit more, if I've got a little more time for, to relate Maitoko, the girls' initiation, to this complex of the moon, because we had, and Ellen is here too, we had an extraordinary experience at Kideru in Yeda Valley, when we were witnessing ephemer ceremonies in relation to the mitochondria. And it's really worth understanding some of this cosmology. So the mitochondria had a mitochondria initiation. This will happen for a cohort of girls. It may include also a woman after childbirth, but basically a cohort of girls who have all probably menstruated. And the idiom for menstruation is to shoot a zebra. Kakwa dongwa is shoot a zebra, or shoot her first zebra if it's first menstruation. But as girls come through menstruation, they'll then be sort of funneled into a cohort who will go through mitochondria together. And the kind of key underlying story of mitochondria is about the origins of ephemer, and connects to a character, Mambedeko, who is also known as the woman with the zebra's penis. Now, Mambedeko used to be, she was a hunter. She used to hunt zebra, then cut off the penises, tie the penises onto herself. And this, she commanded the men to bring all the meat from ephemer animals to her big pot. So she was the one who is the original owner of the meat of ephemer animals. Ephemer animals are large animals with lots of fat, and their fat at the chest and the sides is kind of where all their fat is. So she's famous for this big pot, and she would share out the meat to her wives. Now, in the mitochondria ceremonies, the girls who run in mitochondria run together are the wives of Mambedeko, so-called. But they also, in some sense, play the role of Mambedeko because they've shot zebra. The idiom of menstruation is to shoot zebra, that become Mambedeko herself. And they would, in the traditional ceremonies, be dressed as hunters. They actually, as if hunters, they reverse gender. And what the girls of mitochondria do is they spend several days hunting and chasing down men, the young hunters, whacking them with these strong sticks. So they chase the boys and the men out of the camp. They act and dress as hunters, whilst the male hunters are really disarmed. You can see that the boys down here, they're using their bows to defend themselves, but they cannot carry any arrows. They can't use weaponry during this time. Now, the girls in this ceremony at the beginning, they've gone through a cutting, which can be a genital cutting. It can also be a cutting of torsos. And they're running together because they are bleeding together. And by doing this, bleeding together, the whole community gets carried back to the patriarch who used to own the ephemer. Now, Mambedeko, in fact, she the ceremony as it is, the mitochondria today enacts the whole idea of Mambedeko's pot with a big fight between the women and the men, or the girls and the boys, over a big pot of delicious food. So it is like a reenactment of that original time. And I'm just going to show the lunar phasing that we experienced, and which was really quite extraordinary in Kideru, in this phases of the late waning into the dark moon and the waxing moon in summer of 2003. And you can see that there were every other night ephemer rituals, increasingly kind of intense, emotional ephemer rituals. Kideru, relatively small camp with a fairly small number of women singers, though more women came to sing because of the celebrations of Maitoko. And during that time, well, men were still hunting at this point, but during that time, as the girls went through the ceremonies and they began their running, and they're chasing the boys through these 3 days as the moon was waxing, the there were absolutely no arrows. The men were not carrying arrows around the camp. The hunters could not carry arrows. And this went on until the last day, when the girls and the boys fight over the honey or the big pot of food. And we had this last intense evening of the beautiful singing that was going on. So when asked about why they weren't hunting, why they weren't carrying arrows, the same case, the same idea that women's blood would spoil the arrow poison was quite evident. And then as soon as the ceremony was finished and all the chasing had finished, men appeared again the next morning, going out to perform the hunting. So it was quite clear that the valence of the blood in mitochondria was really like the menstrual blood that spoils arrow poison. Just one last little bit on the aspects, the gender aspects of mitochondria and when it is usually performed, because this will link for Ian to discuss the nightstand hunting here. So just a few more points to make. So if any of the Hadza would be asked about the best or proper time for doing mitochondria, both women and men would talk about the season of Tafa Bay berries. So we had this ceremony in August, which was going into the deep dry season at that time. But the Tafa Bay berries come October to November, which is late dry season to an early wet. And at that time, game would be plentiful thanks to the waterhole nocturnal hunting that Ian will tell us about. James Woodburn talked about this time, late dry season, amongst the Hadza as a time when formal opposition between the sexes is at its height. Women gather Tafa Bay berries, these very, very tasty, delicious kind of dark red berries, but they relinquish first fruits to the initiated epime men, who dramatize their privilege by accusing the women of having eaten some first, forcing the women to deny that. James Woodburn considered that, just to mention, more of the conflict between the sexes, of course, is mitochondria itself. Typically, mitochondria happens at this season with its rough battles between initiated girls and the young men. And mitochondria is supported by the number of large kills at the waterholes that Ian will tell us about. And those kills, because those kills will be epime animals, big animals with lots of fat, they will separate men and women because men will have epime feasts. They are the only ones allowed to eat the epime meat. Women can't come close. So these interlinked rituals, the mitochondria, the Tafa Bay berry first fruits, the mitochondria, and the epime feasts of the men, they traditionally frame challenge and counter-challenge between the sexes within lunar and seasonal cycles. James Woodburn said that Hadza male ritual privilege, which can be defended by force, is really discordant in a society where men actually have little authority over women in day-to-day life. He argued that this strange sort of ritual inequality, which was very distinct from everyday egalitarian relations, provided a weak point of a structure for domination by male elders, though not yet a structure for domination. It hadn't fully emerged. But then Hadza male ritual privilege has coexisted a long time with little effective male control over women. So this surely indicates the weight of mitochondria as counteraction by the women and girls. If you speak only about men's control of epime, that just tells half the story of Hadza gender ritual. The balance of Hadza gender power seems to be dynamic rather than fixed or static. The ritual dramas of initiation for both sexes propel the swing of a pendulum of power, now with one sex and now with the other, as visualized by Morna Finnegan. And as Morna argues, only by maintaining that movement can the fixity of hierarchy be resisted. So we're really saying that egalitarianism itself gets maintained by this pushback between the men's ritual and the women's ritual. The girls of mitochondria, they bleed, they run, they hunt, hit, fight, dance, and sing together reclaiming time and space from the men. At Maitako, they emerge as an organized intergenerational force, the younger reproductive generation militant replaying the story of women's original ownership of Ephemer. Okay, so perhaps we can now shift to Ian. He'll tell us the practical story of Hadza and Bushman hunting by moonlight, and extend the cosmology further to the Bushmen.
Thanks, Camilla. In the late 1980s and early 90s, evidence began to emerge from two teams of human behavioral ecologists working with the Hadzabe that their most productive form of hunting was nightstand hunting by waterholes in the late dry season. The Hadza hunt with powerful longbows, accurate up to about 50 meters. For medium to large game, the arrows are typically poisoned. Nightstand hunting wasn't just seasonally restricted, but largely restricted to moonlit nights. Quantitative analysis showed that it was 3 times more productive than the combined productivity of the 2 other main strategies during that season: scavenging and diurnal pursuit or stalking hunts. It was twice as productive as these alternatives across all seasons, and 50% more productive than rainy season scavenging and stalking hunts. What's the basis for this highly productive form of hunting? In the late dry season, from August to late October or November, water-dependent species tend to aggregate around a few remaining waterholes. Alternatively, some species, like wildebeest and elephant, may walk long distances every day to reach these drinking spots. As with any strategic behavioral choice, the options available present different costs and benefits. Daytime drinking reduces predation risk, but there are costs in terms of thermoregulation and water budgets, and in terms of inter- and intra-species competition. The thermoregulatory and water budget costs can be avoided by early morning and evening drinking, but this increases the costs of competition. Consequently, most species will, if they can, do a considerable amount of nighttime drinking. The costs associated with this strategy are primarily increased predation risk, particularly from lions. But lions are primarily dark moon hunters, making the most of their excellent night vision. This is why most lion kills of humans take place just after full moon, when farmers are returning from their fields and are forgotten about the interval of darkness before moonrise. African herbivores have been shown to be quite good in assessing whether lions have been active in a particular locality over the previous day or two. In making the decision whether to drink nocturnally, 2 factors are particularly important. On the one hand, size. Generally speaking, the larger the species, the lower the predation risk they face. So elephants and rhino are habitual nocturnal drinkers, irrespective of lunar phase. They are followed by the next largest species, buffalo, giraffe, and eland, the largest of the antelope. Now, elephant, rhino, and buffalo all present a serious threat to traditional hunting, to traditional hunters, so they're unlikely to have been habitually targeted. Eland, on the other hand, are relatively docile, and eland bulls can provide huge amounts of fat. And in some environments, eland do the majority of their drinking at night. For medium-sized species, And for larger animals, if they're with young, illumination becomes an increasingly important factor. So nocturnal drinking tends to peak around the nights leading up to full moon. In the Eyasi Basin, this applies particularly to impala, wildebeest, hartebeest, and zebra, precisely the species most often taken in the dry season by the Hadza, largely through nightstand hunting. Most game approach a waterhole by well-trodden game trails. Hadza ambush hunting takes a variety of forms. They may exploit some natural feature overlooking a game trail or the waterhole itself, a rock ledge, a tree bough, or just a stand of grass. Often, however, they construct hunting blinds, reusing them over many years. These are typically circular or semicircular structures, slightly cut into the ground, with a slightly raised peripheral wall of earth or rock, into which have been stuck some branches and grass. Henry Bunn and colleagues reported that the average distance of bow shots from such blinds was less than 20 meters. It turns out that similar findings had been reached among some Kalahari Bushman groups in the late 70s. Although intensively studied from the 50s onwards, this had largely escaped the attention of ethnographers because nightstand hunting had been in decline throughout the 20th century, owing largely to reduced populations of medium to large game, combined with increasingly effective government regulations. What Kroll and Hitchcock found in their 1978 paper was that in the dry season, the Zhu Huan had formerly been quite reliant on nightstand hunting. Some species, like rowan, related to hartebeest, were almost exclusively taken in this way. The most common prey were dik-dik, a small antelope. This probably said more about the decline in large game over the 20th century. 19th century records, together with surface archaeological surveys, provide a clearer impression of how important the strategy formerly was, not only in the Kalahari, but across southern Africa. In the Kalahari, nearly every waterhole likely to retain water into the dry season provided evidence of hunting blinds. Furthermore, even if a waterhole had dried out, it was likely to provide a salt lick. Low forage quality in the dry season means that some species, particularly Hemsbok, require regular salt supplements, typically coming to use the salt licks at night. The former significance of nightstand hunting really comes across from accounts by European ivory hunters in the second half of the 19th century. It was by adopting this strategy, frequently occupying Bushman hunting blinds, that they wiped out the elephant and rhino populations within 30 years. A stalking bow hunter can rarely get within 20 meters of prey in relatively open habitats. A 10-meter range is exceptional. Bushman bows are much smaller than Hadza counterparts and are therefore only accurate to a range of between 20 and 30 meters. So in southern Africa, the advantage of nightstand hunting in terms of getting within closer range of prey would have been even greater than among the Hadza. Strangely, the possible evolutionary implications of these findings weren't pursued. At most, bow and arrow technology extends back 60 to 70,000 years. Before this, a hunter's principal weapon would have been a stone-tipped spear. A global survey of ethnographic literature suggested the effective distance of a hand-thrown spear is in the order of about 10 meters. Subsequent experimental data combined with re-evaluation of ethnographic sources suggests a range of 15 to 20 meters. However, the experimental data with trained throwers showed that accuracy declined from about 60% at 5 meters to 33% at 10 meters. A survey of the 14 hunting blinds around Gi Pan in the Western Kalahari found that the average distance from a game trail was just 6.5 meters, with the average distance to the closest game trail being just 3.3 meters. So nightstand hunting presents an opportunity to get much closer to prey than would be possible through stalking. The clear implication is that before the invention of the bow and arrow, ambush hunting by waterholes on moonlit nights would have played an even more critical role than in the ethnographic present or ethnohistorical records. Just as important, however, is the role of seasonal resource stress in human survival and reproduction. In low latitudes, the dry season is typically a time of low plant productivity. So animal fat takes on particular importance in buffering us against protein poisoning. Metabolically, we can't afford to be metabolizing protein for energy. But African game are particularly lean in the late dry season, as they've had to draw down on body fat and marrow fat reserves to make up for poor forage quality. This means that in habitats like the Kalahari, one would need to kill considerably more animals in the dry season than in the rains, and extract every available gram of fat. In the Hadza case, nightstand hunting has turned a period of natural scarcity into one of relative abundance. In the less optimal conditions of the Kalahari, it seems to have permitted occupation of marginal habitats that would otherwise have to have been abandoned. How far back might such a strategy extend? The earliest stone-tipped spears are inferred from about 500,000 years ago, but these are thought to have primarily served as thrusting rather than thrown weapons. Currently, the most compelling early evidence for stone spear points interpreted as projectiles comes from use-wear analysis in the Levant, dating from around 212,000 years ago. This will probably be pushed back as increased standardization of flake blanks that could be used as spear points is identified from around 300,000. In Africa, this is precisely the span inferred for our speciation, between roughly 150,000 and a little over 300,000 years ago. We don't see lighter weight spear points that could be thrown greater distances than 10 meters until around 100,000 years ago. Now, switching very briefly to Bushman cosmology in relation to the moon. First off, the most invariant ritual is a girl's first menstruation ritual, where she is only released from seclusion according to the phase of the moon, either at the appearance of new moon or at full moon. Upon her emergence, she gives her blessing to young hunters to protect them whilst out on the veldt, but also transferring her potency so as to bring hunting luck. Menstruation is implicitly linked with dark moon, as shown in stories about the Menorrhagic tortoise, who continued to bleed after the return of the moon. Complaining of menstrual cramps, she gets a passing hunter to massage her neck. She pulls her head in, trapping his hand. He's held captive for a long time, starving and cold, the flesh rotting away from his fingers. He's only released when another male figure passes by and is tricked in the same fashion. In some versions, the flesh is restored to his hand through treatment with the moon's water, dew. Beliefs about hunting success are repeatedly cast in lunar idioms, that hunting during the waning moon or no moon will be fruitless. prayers to new moon for hunting success, the full moon providing a metaphor of fatness. Similarly, it would be the height of disrespect for a hunter to look at the moon when an animal had been hit with a poisoned arrow. If one did, the poison would turn to water, the animal would wander too far away, or its fat would simply disappear. Another fairly invariant feature of Bushman cosmologies is the trance or healing dance. This was often held after a successful big game hunt, say of an eland or a giraffe. Such hunts typically took several days, up to a week, which meant that the optimal time for them was the second quarter of the waxing moon. This helps account for the frequent observation that healing dances were often held at full moon. This is without taking into account the former significance of nightstand hunting. Myths concerning the origin of the sexual division of labor are also frequently cast in lunar idioms. I'll give just one example, a condensed version of a story told by an unnamed Namibian bushman in the 1990s.
Are we going to end with this story, Ian?
Yeah.
That's good. Okay.
The moon is nearly dead. Tonight it is a bowl throwing water on the earth. Tomorrow night, the moon will start to grow again. Time too grows on the moon. We are the moon people. After we die, the good people, they walk to the moon. Everyone is very happy and content in the moon Kalahari. You say, I have told you a charming story. You wish you could tell me that you believe it to be true. But you have to tell me that Americans travel to the moon in some kind of super aeroplane. The moon is a desert, you say. You say you're sorry to have to tell me this. Why are you sorry? I know you're not a liar and a thief. And I'm also not a liar and a thief. But tell me this, when the Americans traveled to the moon, was the moon full? When the moon has grown until it's full, it's a wonderful place. Not, of course, when it's dying. Okay. That's me.
Thanks, Ian. Great. So I hope people are fairly convinced that the moon is really important for African hunter-gatherers wherever we go on the continent. And are there any questions or comments, including if Jerome would like to put something in, but he doesn't have to? Anybody who'd like to?
Well, I'll just make a couple of comments. I'm sorry I'm so slow-witted today. I mean, it is remarkable the consistency with which the moon figures in these different cosmologies. And it's perhaps worth just reminding listeners that, you know, these are groups of people whose languages are entirely different. I mean, just completely unrelated. And of course, they've been separated by literally tens of thousands of years. In the Bushman, San Kalahari, and the hunter-gatherers of Congo Basin, I mean, up to 104,000 years, the genetic testing suggests. So, you know, we've got here groups of people who've been not in any sort of obvious communication for extraordinary expanses of time, but have retained these extraordinarily robust cosmological orientations based around the moon. And it really is quite remarkable and something that's extremely striking. And I think that, you know, when we one of the ways that this is interpreted by arrogant academics from places like London and the European or American world is that this is some sort of primitive belief system that's, but I think that's just such an arrogant misunderstanding of what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is an incredibly robust and effective system of organizing human societies. And that really is what I find very striking about this sort of material. It's not at all about primitiveness. It's about actually how human beings optimally organize themselves in relation to ecological environments. And this is something that, because we all live in boxes inside cities, or so many of us do, we forget just how important it is to be part of your environment, to be engaged with the way the moon waxes and wanes, with the way the water comes and goes according to season, with the way that the animals become fat or become thin as their food supplies vary. And these big brains that we are so proud of really have a huge cost. And if we don't consider the material costs of brains, we really lose something very clear about how we became who we are. And while lunarchism is something which many people fail to understand, it really is at the heart of what made us human and what enabled these extraordinary brains to develop in the first place. And so thank you all for sharing so clearly the continuities between these very distantly related groups, but of course who do represent, again, if you look at the genetic phylogenetic tree of humanity, are all at the very base of the human expansion. And so I think, discounting these things as irrelevant to human origins really is an extraordinary blinkered way of thinking about human origins. And in fact, of course, there are many more similarities than you've raised. The question of arrow poison being spoilt by, it's absolutely standard across not just hunter-gatherers, but many other hunting peoples who use poisons. Even just touching weapons ruins those weapons. They start missing if pregnant, or pregnant or menstruating women touch weapons. These are things which really are almost human consistent across all groups. And the other thing, why the moon is important is because of this very fine education of attention, education of practice that it provides to those people who have these sophisticated lunarchist cosmologies, exactly about how you can resist different groups, particularly gender groups, because that's the most significant group in a classless society, where you don't have elites, you don't have the underdogs who are constantly striving to undermine the elites. This sort of myth of progress is actually the story of how elites and underdogs constantly vie with one another to try and increase their control or undermine the control of others. Whereas in these societies where you don't have classes and these sorts of hierarchies, gender is the basic division of human bodies and human beings. And so these sorts of mechanisms really are at the center of the human story. And anyway, I think you've all very beautifully brought that out. So really thank you. And I hope we can have some good questions or discussion going forward.
Thanks, Jerome. You better rest your voice here. Thank you very much. That was a major point, that these are so diverse, the lineages of these groups, the forest hunter-gatherers in Central Africa, the Khoisan, Southern Africa, and the Hadza in East Africa. Their relationships go back tens of thousands, 100,000 or more years, basically. And they've retained such a strong similarity in their cosmology. So important.
Maybe I could just ask Chris to elaborate a little bit about the shores of Eden and how we can understand something about where this cosmology may have originated from. I mean, it's speculative, of course, because we can never know who those original groups were that inhabited that part of Southwest Africa. But I think in this context, it might be interesting for the audience to appreciate some of this new research that's coming out.
Well, I mean, first of all, I can't quite answer the question, but people sort of tend to think that, okay, we have half of us have a menstrual cycle, and it's roughly lunar. It's on average 29.5 days. But actually, that's in itself quite striking, because we are great apes, and chimpanzees have an average cycle length of about 36 days. Bonobos, another species of chimpanzee, in some ways perhaps even closer to us, not genetically, but in behavioral terms, the females have a cycle length of 40 days. And if you take primates as a whole, they have a sort of range oscillating, somewhere around, I don't know, somewhere between, say, 24, 25 and 40 days. And you can sort of say it's oscillating around the moon. But we humans have exactly the length of menstrual cycle that you would predict if it gave fitness advantages to evolving human females to synchronize with each other, synchronize their cycles with each other using the moon as a clock. You would predict 29.5 days. It's interesting that orangutans have 29 days, and there are various things one can talk about that. But I mean, the critical thing is that in terms of gender, chimpanzees, common chimpanzees, are extremely male dominated because the females have to space out looking for relatively scarce food. Apparently the bonobos were a species of chimpanzee that got south of the Congo River and found an absolute paradise of abundance, and the females were able to forage together instead of isolating. And as a result of foraging together, they were able to bond together and defend one another against the kind of harassment that male chimpanzees perpetrate. And bonobos are actually essentially matriarchal. And I mean, just to try to answer Jerome's question, it does seem as if our species must have evolved in areas of abundance. In other words, we wouldn't have chosen to live out in sparse, hot, dry savannas. We were much more likely to evolve in mixed waterside ecologies, areas of trees and lakes and riversides, with, of course, plenty of grassland as well. And I'm now talking about going right back, to the origins of even bipedalism, just walking on two legs, which if you can't walk upright, you're going to drown in those areas. You won't be able to forage. So that's one issue. And then, of course, another incredibly important issue is what's the advantages of female synchronizing? And the advantage of female synchronizing is it makes it impossible for an alpha male to have a harem. If the females are synchronizing their cycles, there's no way an alpha male can get them all pregnant simultaneously. And so synchrony is a way of leveling up, if you like. Synchronizing cycles means that more males are brought into the breeding system. And then, of course, you have the lions that Ian was mentioning. There's so many factors which combine together to produce our species. In my own view, right through the whole of hominin evolution, we would have preferred to inhabit places which were not too dry. We would needed to live, relatively close to fresh water. But the critical thing about Ian's amazing work, which he's only been doing the last couple of years, he's shown us how in that particular period of the speciation of Homo sapiens in the last 300,000 years, what would have been the most difficult kind of environments, which are savanna environments in the dry season, was those environments which previously would have been periods of real difficulty, real scarcity, but transformed from being environments and periods of scarcity to being periods of abundance, thanks to this astonishing invention of nightstand hunting. And that's clearly what actually made us human. The final phase of human evolution, the emergence of Homo sapiens, was based on this essentially once a month, around full moon, successful hunting, around waterholes, hiding behind hunting blinds or other cover. So I mean, really, we have this. I mean, I won't say much more, except to say that why on earth do evolutionary theorists think in terms of seasonality in the sun, and just leave out the clock, which for hunter-gatherers is the critical one. It's no question about it. It's the moon, and clearly the moon gets left out because of patriarchy, because people think the moon's moonshine, or if you're connected with the moon, you're moonstruck, or if you're mentally deranged, you're a lunatic. I mean, all these things are part of the language, and unfortunately, these weird patriarchal prejudices continue to infect us even when we're supposed to be shot of all that superstition. We're supposed to be scientists, for God's sake. So it makes me quite annoyed when the moon gets dismissed on the grounds that it's moonshine and all that stuff. I mean, it's we wouldn't even have life on this planet without this extraordinarily huge moon. It's this massive moon that gave us seasons, gave us a stable spin, produced seasonality. I mean, everything about the fact that we're such a weird planet because we're a living planet is to do with the fact that we have this we're quite near the sun, but we've got this enormous moon, and that we're a sun-moon system.
There's a question about the Evangeli, which I don't really want to put a lot of stress on Jerome here, from Chris van Roden. How does occasional polygyny in the Evangeli get reconciled with Aquila? Does occasional polygyny mess up the system?
Well, to be honest, I haven't actually been able to interview the woman who was the one particular case of polygyny that I was able to hear about. The times when I've been in the places where she would go for one of her husbands was when she was with the other husbands. So what she had is one husband.
Is this polyandry? Is a woman with two husbands?
Polygamy, or yeah. So there's one. Okay.
Polygyny, so like a woman with a husband with more than one wife. But if we've got a woman with more than one husband, that's really interesting too.
Well, yeah. So I mean, what the Vangeli do is they never do this in the same place at the same time. It just causes conflict, arguments. It's they have songs about it. You know, just it's something which women don't like, and they're very clear about that. It does occasionally happen because, you know, sometimes women fall in love with the same man, and the man may be able to, you know, maintain one of the wives in one place and the other wife in another. And it's part of that autonomy that people have to just get up and go and move where they like. I mean, the Vangeli say, you know, as soon as you can walk, you can decide where you sleep. And so children, if they're upset with their parents, will not stay with their parents, they'll go elsewhere. And it's the same with married people. A woman doesn't need to, if she wants to divorce her husband, it's just, she just gets up and goes. She doesn't even need to explain it or give any reason for why she's leaving. There's no word for goodbye in Vangeli, which I think is very illustrative of this freedom of movement. So people make arrangements according to their personal, abilities to negotiate, navigate such complex things. And in the few cases of, I think now that people are becoming more centralized in towns, and you get individuals who may get jobs, that they start adopting many more of the sort of traditions of sedentary populations in these areas, which are very polygamous. But in the forest areas, I've not come across a man living in the same camp with two wives, just as this woman who was married to two men was never in the same camp with both of them together. And I think that that's the way these things are negotiated. And so it doesn't, you know, affect the Aquila. Sleeping around, I mean, Vangeli, you know, as I think Chris mentioned, you know, teenagers are extremely promiscuous. I mean, shockingly so to sort of more uptight groups of people. But from their point of view, it's an important period of experimentation, of learning about your body, about learning about other people's bodies, so that when you do decide who you want to settle down with, you know, you will have a good, happy life. Sex is important. Sex matters. And so, you know, these things work. I mean, I think I've never heard of anybody who's managed to negotiate having more than two wives or two husbands, for that matter. But maybe there are people around who are able to do this. But you know, evolving serial monogamy is more apt, I think, as an expression of what most people do. Most people will have more than one partner in their life, and sometimes they overlap. But generally, that's the cause of a lot of problems. It's not something which is resolved in sort of nice, easy, neat ways, or dominating or domineering ways. It's lots of fights and arguments and big noise and trouble and endless, big issues that really spoil camp life. And one of the important things in camps is that sounds are good. The forest doesn't like lots of argument and strife and discussion. She closes herself to the camp if that's what the forest is hearing. And so, generally people try and avoid such situations. And in a camp where someone tries to, say, keep two women together and all the arguments that follow, people will just start abandoning that camp. And eventually they'll find themselves on their own. And for sure, one of the women will just, not hang around. People won't stay for trouble. So it can happen, but it requires separation essentially.
Do we know anything about eclipses of the moon with African hunter-gatherers? Because I haven't ever experienced it, and I haven't seen what happens. Chris, do you know anything about this? Because there was something that Kristen Hawkes told you, wasn't there?
Yeah, I made this prediction that if you have a full moon where everyone's happy hunting and maybe bring the meat home and having a real party, and then suddenly the moon starts to turn into a new moon because there's an eclipse. My prediction was that, as Levi-Strauss describes and so many other mythologists have described, everything, it's all the wrong, we're all doing the wrong thing. We should suddenly we have to sort of empty the pots, make a huge noise, and sort of revert back to what we should be doing if it was new moon. Anyway, Kristen Hawkes, at one of the early meetings at the London School of Economics of the Conference of Hunters and Gatherers, must have been 1988, she triumphantly pointed out, she said, "Chris, do you know what happened with the Hadza? I was there when the eclipse of the moon." Nothing. They didn't didn't even bother with it. Just they do. It's going to pass quite soon, and nothing at all happened. So she was very pleased to point that out.
With a full moon, I mean, an eclipse is going at the full moon, and that isn't necessarily so critical as what happens at the dark moon and solar eclipse. But yeah, I don't know.
I was present once. So I remember it was an evening, and everyone was saying that we're going to do a big masana tonight. We're going to have a big celebrate. We're going to call the spirits out, and it was a malobe. And there's a malobe you perform when there's moonlight, and I remember thinking, oh, I'm exhausted today. I wish people would just go to bed. It's going to be so, you have to come out when one of these performances is on. So I thought, oh, I'll just have a quick snooze after supper and just get some energy so I can handle the all-nighter that was coming. And I remember snoozing away and thinking, oh, I'm getting such a long snooze here. And I thought the moon would be up by now. And when I eventually came out of my tent, my friend Emeka, he said to me, "Hey, Jerome, the moon just disappeared. We've been wondering about this. What goes on when that's happening?" And so me putting on my sort of academic brain, I said, and I've described moons and the sun and how we move around and blah, blah, blah. And he just sat there and looked very seriously and understood it and said, "Oh, okay, well, all right, I get it, yeah." And that was that. Instead of being the proper anthropologist and asking him what he thought about it, I think it's because I'd just woken up and...
I mean, I would say Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, I know Ian's going to come in and say, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas in the old way, she describes the Kalahari in the late 40s and 50s. And an eclipse of the moon is a huge, massive event. The lions are out, the moon's being eaten. There really is a very major effect. But anyway, go on, Ian.
Well, just to say, they were distressed by this thing happening, but it's just that I didn't ask the right questions.
Yeah, amongst, I think, several Bushman groups, it's been recorded that they considered an eclipse as being caused by a lion putting its paw over the moon.
To give it darkness. Yeah,
to get darkness for more effective hunting.
Yeah, makes sense.
that's right. Yeah, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas says that
Yeah,
as well. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
great. Yes.
Yeah.
And I just wanted also to get out of Ian about the gender of the moon, because we've noted with the forest groups and the Hadza that it tends to be male. But
Yeah.
what about
No, with the Bushman, it's much more mutable. It tends to be that the gender of the moon changes. It can be, tends to be male during the waxing phase and becomes female at full moon, which of course makes sense. Like, you know, if the full moon is seen as a period of abundance and fertility, that fits.
Sorry, you said male at full moon. That's
No, female at full moon.
Female at full moon, yeah.
You would expect the moon to be woman's biggest husband when the moon's visiting women, which of course it should do, according to all the models.
During the waxing.
Dark moon, new moon, yes.
Yeah,
that's exactly what you said.
So it's quite possible that I wonder whether the Hadza have gender mutability too, that we haven't really worked out yet, because they've got these different names going with the moon quite a bit that sort of shift.
Just a bit.
Yeah. So and then the forest people as well, there may be some mutability, we don't know.
Now, one thing that's quite striking is how difficult it's to see the moon in the forest.
Yeah.
You know, the canopy really does obscure the sky. I mean, things like the Milky Way, it's quite rare. You just have to be on a riverbank or somewhere like that to really get a view of it. And those are the places, you know, forest people tend not to like. They don't, I mean, it's changing now because so much of their forest is being occupied by outsiders. But, you know, when we were there, you know, people were very explicit, you know, hot, open places are bad places. You want cool, shady places. That's where it's good for humans to be. It's where life is good. And so it is remarkable that the moon still figures so prominently in their cosmology, even though it's such an you know, obscured presence.
Yeah, I have a speculative idea in this respect. I mean, it's clearly we wouldn't expect lunar phase-locked hunting to be significant in a forest environment. However, I know that one of the most highly valued prey animals is the bongo across the whole tropical forest zone of Africa. And the bongo is a nocturnal antelope, and like the hemsbok in southern Africa, it's very dependent on salt licks. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if you know, bongo visits to salt licks at night tended to be lunar phase locked. Presumably their principal predator would have been the leopard. So that's something to bear in mind. It's not going to be as significant, but it may there may still be, or there may have been, when, I mean, now bongo is very rare, but like when they were more abundant, it may have been more significant in the past.
It's interesting you mentioned bongo. You know, when I was talking to people about which animals were Aquila, they'd say, oh, it's the red animals. They're particularly Aquila. And the most Aquila of all animals is the bongo, i.e. the one you should avoid killing. And, you know, bongo are remarkable. For people who don't know this antelope, I mean, they are extraordinarily beautiful. They have a really bright red coat with white stripes down running down their flank. And they are huge. I mean, they're the sort of the body size of a cow, but with, you know, antelope length legs. So they tower above you. I mean, 2.5 meters. They're enormous, and they have these beautiful long horns which spiral up. And what is amazing about them is they often walk, and I think this is to protect themselves from leopards. in large groups. So you see herds of them. You don't see one, or you can, of course, just see one or two sometimes, but you often will see 10, 15, even 20. And, you know, the Benjeli say, if you ever see that, you just run, you get the hell out of there, because they are the bosses. And they say they really are the bosses of the forest. That's why they're a killer. They're very fussy. They don't like walking in muddy, you know, messy places. They like sandy clearings, as you've just said. And they really are very, you know, just very majestic and royal and special. And for that reason, you know, we don't hunt them.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, the ultimate killer animal, actually.
Any thoughts?
I want to ask Jerome if you just tell us something which I often ask you to say, because I'm not quite sure if you published it, but I think you have. But you just mentioned how Benjeli men consider menstruation to be a particular time of fertility, and if you really want to get a baby and make a baby, you need to kind of break the menstrual taboos and have sex during menstruation. But the particular thing I seem to remember you saying was that the men have a kind of a laugh about this, because they know that really the moon should be with a woman when she's menstruating, and if you're as a man having sex at that time, it's like you saying ha ha to the moon, I've got one over on you. And it's a kind of joke that you're kind of cuckolding the moon. You've actually managed to get there, but you shouldn't get. But on the benefit of that is you're going to get a baby out of it. How accurate is my memory of something I think you said at one of your lovely talks you gave? So like a rivalry between the human husband and woman's biggest husband, the moon.
Yeah, it's interesting because men will only say that to each other. They won't say that when women are present. Yeah, you cheated the moon, as a sort of congratulations, you've got her pregnant. And yes, you know, the moment women are considered to be the most fertile is when they're menstruating. And I mean, it's there was something I was going to say, my brain fog just got me there. But it really is the point where, you know, if you are really determined to make your wife pregnant, you make, that's what I was going to say. It's not actually taboo to have sex, but it's just when a woman's menstruating. It's just that you have these consequences, if you do, of making yourself very vulnerable to attack from animals. And so, you know, it's more this sort of conflict that men consider themselves to be within with other animals, that you've got to be careful. You know, it really is dangerous when you go hunting. I mean, a buffalo is an extraordinarily dangerous animal to try and take on. Even pigs can do you terrible damage. Monkeys, some of them are really, you know, if they're wounded with a poisoned arrow, they're extremely dangerous. You don't approach, you wait till they die of just the poison. So the risks of hunting are something which men are very sensitive to for good reason. And so the whole way that that's articulated through our Aquila is just something that is part of that conception of being in conflict. And it's very different, of course, to these Northwest Coast hunters who see themselves as somehow, you know, the prey is giving itself to you. I've mentioned this to my Benjeli friends. They say, oh, no. You've got to use all your guile and wile and wisdom and stealth, and, you know, you really got to, you know, surprise them, because you can't tell them you're coming. They'll just run off, or they'll attack you and damage you. And so I think, you know, these sorts of there's much more similarity, I think, in the sort of Aboriginal case, where blood, you know, has many of the same valencies as we find in Central Africa. And what's interesting about the Aboriginal case from the point of view of Aquila and egalitarianism is that they have this very interesting contradiction between an extraordinarily egalitarian economic order and then an extremely hierarchical ritual order. And I think that that's why James Woodburn really thought that epime was the main pathway for inequality to emerge, because he looked at what was being talked about in the ethnographies of Australian people, and he saw how ritual was the major way that men asserted their control over, well, elder men asserted their control over younger men through access to women in marriage, and the initiation cycle that people had to follow in order to be eligible for marriage. So I think that you know, these things are very deep within human history and storytelling.
The big danger in along that line, though, Jerome, isn't there? Because I mean, I've been trying to read The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrow, and they just say that ritual is private property, and ritual is the state, and ritual is always top down. So you get, they're just saying hunter-gatherers can't really be egalitarian because they have private property in the state in the form of ritual. And of course, it seems to me quite evident that that something like the Alima ritual that you know, from the Mbuti, or any of those first menstruation rituals, they're not top down, they're bottom up. I mean, okay, the older women play a huge role in all that, but I mean, there's a collectivist reason why you want to make sure that girl, when she's at her most attractive and fertile, isn't monopolized by some alpha male. And so it's a bottom up resistance to, if you like, the potential for alpha male dominance that produces those menstrual rituals. So I don't at all like the idea that ritual is oppressive as a sort of matter of fact, but it's true that the male versions of those rituals can indeed, as James was saying, you know, end up where many of the Australians are. But it's too much in anthropology. But Bourdieu and all sorts of people somehow just ritual is, it's like, you know, the Queen's coronation or something. It's always the state, and it's really important that bottom-up ritual is where it really comes from. Ritual starts bottom-up, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the point is not that it is always the pathway, but it is one of the pathways. Yeah. And of course, you know, we have so much hierarchy, inequality, patriarchy around the world, that what we need to do, I think, is really understand the multiple ways that it's evolved in these different contexts. And some of it is to do with material resources and control of those resources, and others through, you know, so-called, you know, ritual resources and the manipulation of those. And you know, not always. And clearly, you know, what we see in the Congo Basin is these extraordinarily elaborate communal rituals, which do quite the opposite, which disarm the potential for patriarchy to hold or matriarchy to grab hold. And it's that disarming of the gods, in a sense, which is what those rituals are primarily concerned with. And so,
can I just add here, the word disarming is so good, Jerome, because when Camilla was describing the mitoco and the blood neutralizing the arrow poison, people see what's happening is women are disarming men. Men don't have weapons. They can't use weapons against women because they're disarmed by women's most powerful weapon, which is their blood. It needs to be put that way around. But yes, that's lovely, the way you talk about disarming the gods. That's brilliant. It's beautiful. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's a question from Darcia about how long menstrual blood affects
the weapons. Yeah,
and I mean, it just ruins them. So you have to do a whole, I mean, at least in the Benjele case, you know, I remember one time there was some sort of question about why we weren't, you know, successful in hunting, and people were getting hungry. And so we did a big, and one of the reasons people thought was that it must have been one of the menstruating girls or women had somehow touched some of the weapons and has spoilt our luck. And
yeah, it's women's fault.
Well, I mean, it was just one of the possible, you know, as people were thinking of all the possibilities. So what we did is, and it's interesting, it's leaf whipping, which is the purification from menstrual or potential pollution. But I mean, not just menstrual, it could have been just bad vibes, which cause hunting failure too. And so all the weapons in the camp were all brought out, and anything anybody had, even if it was a spearhead that wasn't yet mounted on a shaft, and we put them all on this tree. And then there were particular songs that had to be sung while everyone took branches, but particularly, and this was led by the women, the branches were taken and they were whipped on the weapons. And this, you know, went on for quite a, you know, good hour or so, everyone coming by and whipping, singing and dancing. And it was very interesting because the other area where leaf whipping is used is during the girls' and women's yele, which is, we've talked a lot about Ngoku, but we've talked much less about yele, which is the particular rituals associated with how women control the hunt. So a man's hunting is only a response to women's yele. Women's yele is what catches the animals first. It's what ensures that men actually meet animals when they go out and hunt. And in yele, and this is one of the few times when I've seen, sort of some sort of magical brew being used by the Benjele, the women drink this particular brew, and then they whip their legs. And there's a curious thing: if you're an unmarried girl whose mother's still alive, you whip both your legs. And if you're a woman whose mother's now dead and you are married, you whip just one of your legs. But what the reasoning is, I don't know. But anyway,
Yele is women's management of the hunt, isn't it?
Yeah.
Women manage the hunt, and then go off and do the sort of physical business.
And it's particularly significant for big game hunting, elephant hunting, actually. And I think it's to do with the terror that elephant hunting quite sensibly instills in anybody who would be reckless enough to go after an elephant with a spear. It's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And so how do you get men to actually go and do it? Well, I think yele is a very important part of that explanation, is that during the yele, after they've done this leaf whipping, all the leaves that they've used whipping their legs, they then dump on top of the hut of the tuma, the elephant hunter that they want to go hunting. And, if you're a man and all these women are singing beautifully all night, then come, at 4 or 5 in the morning and dump the leaves on your hut. You're really going to lose a lot of sort of face if you just say, oh, no, I'm not going.
It sounds quite a bit like the Sharanua special hunt type of challenge, that the famous Janet Siskin's famous account of that, of the girls. It's also worth mentioning that they're using green whip for the on the young hunters, but they use green leaves for the Erpeme people, Erpeme men.
I remember when during Matiko, there's this great line, like total gender inversion, these line of women on the warpath with their sticks, and they were coming past me. I'm an old geezer looking pretty pathetic, I'm sure, sitting on my chair. But anyway, they all had to give me a bit of a go with the leaves that sort of hit me on the head a little bit. But on the other hand, they're really after the young men.
Yeah, they want the young guys.
But it's this, anyone who thinks that hunter-gatherer gender is sort of sex role stereotypes, I mean, really think again. Those women everything's reversed. So when the women are on the warpath, it's Ngoku or Matiko, women are reverse gender. They're now the hunters, they're the ones with the weapons, and they've disarmed the other sex. I remember again during Matiko, it's just so amazing. All the little boys, even 9-year-olds, 12-year-olds, they always got their bows and arrows with them, always, except during Matiko.
The little girl.
Suddenly, complete disarmament. No boys got any weapons.
Yeah.
And it just, what an achievement by those women. For several days, by the way, 4 or 5 days, complete disarmament.
Yeah, at least 3 days. It was 3 days, but it could go longer. Depending on the food, it could go longer.
And then the lovely thing was to see the little kids all painted up like zebras,
painted,
and all the little girls surrounding the boys and taunting them and teasing them, and the boys just having to put up with it. And the most the boys could do was just maybe try to take a weapon away from a girl, but no way could a boy, like a 9-year-old boy, in any way use any kind of playful stick against the sort of 7-year-old girls. I mean, everything's reversed. It's like a sort of International Women's Day.
And I think, again, we're coming back.
Pictures of that which I took.
It is this core gender relations and how you manage them in a healthy way so that neither becomes dominant. And that really is so central. And, we can talk about it easily now, looking at this ethnography, but let's try and put it in practice in our society, and then suddenly it becomes so difficult. And that is what particularly annoys me, I think, about the Venn-Graber sort of dismissal of these achievements. These are remarkable achievements, and they are so remarkable that we are completely at a loss as to how to make them happen again within our own societies, despite, 50 years of very active feminism, all the different movements that Me Too and so on that have been happening. We're still at a very sort of primitive stage compared to these hunter-gatherers that we're discussing today.
Beautifully put. Absolutely right. Yeah.
So true.
Yeah, these are the real achievements of humanity.
For sure.
And the lovely idea that they're still fighting, but it's playful. And that's, all animals, the most enjoyable fight, the enjoyable form of play is fighting. It's the sort of what could be aggression, but isn't, because it's only play. And it's just so, it's just such an important insight that hunter-gatherers are governed by play. It's a kind of warfare between the sexes, but it's
war, but it's play, but it's war. Yeah. So
you put it very well.
All the insights that they've tried to make out of warfare models, arguing that warfare models creates group identity and group cohesion. But of course, it cannot possibly create any kind of sexual morality or the sorts of menstrual taboos and rules of epime or ekila. That can't come out of warfare, not if it's group on group warfare. But as soon as the warfare becomes between the sexes with playfulness, then it just comes, it just emerges. It's part of the whole process. Completely intrinsic to the process.
I think, I dislike the idea of warfare in this context. I think it's something much more beautiful. War produces rape, it produces pillaging, it produces all sorts of really nasty gender relationships. But what we're talking about here is something, and I think the carnival language that Morna uses, the sort of the bodies speaking and sort of teasing one another, this old men are no good, we like young men, and this sort of thing. It's much more playing on those sort of fundamental aspects of growth of human bodies, of the inevitability of growing old, this is the sort of interplays, and so what happens, instead of violence, it's humor, and that's what's becomes so apparent when you're there and those girls are coming out with their sticks in the maitoko, is that it really is funny, and although
they whack pretty hard, though.
They whack hard and it hurts. But at the same time, there's a sort of an underlying humor to it that sort of allows it not to become that sort of raping conflict that we're familiar with in our
it doesn't, but we need to say there's an element of warfare, except that it's reversed. It seems to me that it's not right to say, oh no warfare, it's purely play. When animals play, they play with their teeth, they play with biting, but it's only play. So it's like I prefer to think of a reversal of warfare, but there's some, as Camilla says, they might have go very, very serious. I remember the boys all locking themselves up in one of the minibuses that we had and locking the door, and then the girls started shaking it and nearly rolling the whole thing over.
Thought they were going to break all the cars' windscreens.
And those boys were scared. They were scared. So
it was funny.
There's an element of the war. There's an element of, let's call it, the battle of the sexes. But of course, the triumph is that it's turned into pure play. But to sort of say that it isn't a victory over warfare, because warfare was isn't right. There's an element of warfare because the sexes are always got, we expect kind of differences between the sexes because that's kind of part of what sexuality is all about. Males and females don't have the same interests. But the brilliant triumph of the human revolution was that what was warfare was transcended into something joyful and playful and beautiful.
Well, anyway, we can disagree on that one. I think just war is not even a phenomena for these societies. It's impossible. You just can't mobilize.
I know. All I was doing, Jerome, was because that model has a lot of purchase in evolution from a lot of very patriarchal male anthropologists, and they think it's the best answer, but it's obviously not. But we can kind of subvert that answer by and use the ideas of reverse dominance. So
I mean, a battle of the sexes I can accept, but war.
Okay. All right, that's
okay, we'll try that one. It's
I'm satisfied with that. Battle of the sexes is fine. Yeah.
Do we want to wrap up now? We've reached 8:30, and I think that Jerome ought to have a nice, good night's sleep with some night nurse or something to
He's got lots of Lemsip, I gather.
Lemsip is what you need. Ginger, honey and ginger. And just to say, for people, we are going to be on Zoom for the next, well, probably before Christmas. I don't know what's happening with the meeting before Christmas, but next week is Chris Stringer, which will be a wonderful talk telling us about all the latest things happening with Harbin, the Dragon Man, and Homo bodoensis now. They're trying to kick Cecil Rhodes out of human taxonomy, which is not before time. So there's so much going on with the fossil record at the moment, and new stuff with Dennis Ovens. I'm not going to be there because I'm doing a talk on Hadza stories for Plymouth University Arts Institute. So anyone who's interested in that, you can get in touch. I'll give you the links. But anyway, Chris Stringer next week, and the week after, a wonderful talk as well from Sheena Lou Levy, again on Zoom, with material on children and learning and innovation in evolution. She's done some amazing work with the Bayaka and the Hadza and other colleagues. And we'll see what happens with the meeting before Christmas. I don't know if Chris has got any ideas. We're going to do a fairy tale before Christmas. So we've still got 3 sessions before Christmas, if you like. They're probably on Zoom, obviously.
Okay, everybody.
So see people next week.
Thanks,
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, everybody, and Jerome, and everybody, and Chris.